So I'd like to welcome everyone here. Good evening. Welcome to Community Rising, an online series of film and discussion evenings in celebration of Residences at Vantage Point's 30th anniversary. My name's Patty Hutton. I'm the Director of Marketing here for Vantage Point. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a not-for-profit continuing care retirement community here in Town Center. We offer an active lifestyle for adults ages 60 and over with the peace of mind of on-site assisted living, memory care, and comprehensive skilled nursing should they ever be needed. We are very pleased we are able to present this inspirational series of discussions around such very important topics. Our first topic last week discussed the political progress of women, and tonight's program is focused on anti-racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. We'll start with an edited video to allow for time for the length of our entire program of a 1992, yet still very relevant Oprah Winfrey show featuring an exercise, Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes, involving activist Jane Elliott and an unsuspecting audience. Afterwards, we will see and hear a conversation between Candace Dodson-Reed, the Chief of Staff and Executive Director, Office of Equity and Inclusion at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Tom Cole, attorney with Talkin' & O. Now, here's Oprah Winfrey. Okay, well, thank you all for watching with the video for us. We are going to welcome our panelists today. We're going to welcome Candace Dodson-Reed and Tom Cole. And again, if you have questions you'd like answered, please type them into the chat feature.
Great, thank you so much for having us, and we really appreciate this platform to talk about such an important issue. I'll get started, and I think we'd be remiss if we did not put this in context of today. You know, today in Kentucky, in Louisville, many folks believe that justice was not served in the case of Breonna Taylor, who many may know was shot in her home with the police entering the home and with a no-knock, and Tom will correct me if I get this wrong from a legal perspective, but with a no-knock warrant. And as it turned out, she was not guilty of what she was accused of. And I think it's important to think about that as we have this conversation about anti-racism, about what we saw in the video, because as much as we, hope things change and we hope we progress as a society, we see that in many cases things are the same. This particular filming of the Oprah show took place in 1992, right after the LA riots. And now here we are again. I have not looked at the news yet, but I'm very sure that there are some riots taking place in Kentucky now because justice, again, was not served in that particular case. And so as much as we think things have changed, as I mentioned, we are still in a society where racism and racist policy continues to permeate our culture and permeates America. And when we think about anti-racism and think about what the recent conversation has been about anti-racism, we really should think about how policies and procedures and initiatives continue to perpetuate the challenges that we see now as it relates to Black people.
Yeah, I mean, Candace, you raise an important, not only important points, but an important phrase, and that is anti-racism. And that's important because Jane Elliott, the woman who was sort of conducting this experiment, non-experiment, whatever we can call it, she was taking the approach of empathy to at least have these people acknowledge that racism exists and that it's nonsensical, which is a very good encapsulation of where the conversation was in the 1990s. I know, being a white male coming up in the white culture, that the presupposition was that we were past racism. Martin Luther King baptized all of us as a country. Racism was gone. And that was a comfortable, and we were going to have Black History Month in all white classrooms and write essays about Martin Luther King. And that was going to be the resolution to racism. But the conversation now is actually much different, which becomes a measure of anti-racism, that the status quo and simply acknowledging that racism exists is not enough. It is not enough to, quote, not be racist, because the culture that exists right now is racist, and it requires active participation on an anti-racist effort to address that.
Yeah, and I do have some comments on that note. I do have a comment from the audience that would like Candace and Tom to address those of us who were born in another country, have lived here for the majority of our lives, are US citizens, but are still not accepted by either Blacks or whites.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best to comment on that, because I just don't prescribe to that. You know, I think I think we have a hard time in this country looking at what is similar about folks and what is different, and accepting and celebrating what is different, right? And I do this exercise sometimes at work, and also in some of the consulting work I've done, where I say, you know, we start with talking about our stories, right? And talk about, and I almost did this today, but we don't have a ton of time, but talk about our stories and who we are and where we, you know, came from and how we were raised. And what you'll find generally is that there are many similarities. We all want great things for our kids, if we have kids. We all want our families to be safe and have access to great education, and to have, you know, the basic, the Maslow level, you know, things, right? Like food, water, shelter, those kinds of things. And that's fantastic. And I think where we get hung up in our society is that we don't want to then celebrate the differences. I am a Black woman, and I identify as a Black woman, and I want you to see me as a Black woman. And I want that to be celebrated, and understand my perspective as a Black woman. And so that question is hard for me to answer, because I don't think that way. Like, I don't, you know, I accept anyone who, regardless of culture or religion or who they choose to love, or who they, or you know, whomever they worship. I mean, if they're good, decent human beings, we, you know, in our home, we were taught to accept them. And I think where we go wrong many times is that we look at the differences and say how negative and bad they are, as opposed to celebrating the differences and looking at the similarities as well.
And I want to build off of that. I actually read a fantastic book that I know is on Candace's pile of books to read, which is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Yes. And I highly recommend that to the questioner and all of you, because what it suggests is that this is not purely a racial dynamic, that there's an additional dynamic having to do with caste. And the reason why it's not purely a racial dynamic is because you will have immigrants, such as Irish Americans, such as those that come from another country, that are immigrants, but yet come to an existing caste system and are already presupposed to be above people of color from different countries and different origins, because the United States is built off of this caste system that many people, regardless of where they come from, have the opportunity to take a higher level in, simply because of where they came from or how they're coming in from a socioeconomic standpoint. Because it's critical in the United States that we do look beyond black and white, while understanding that black and white is the fundamental racial issue in the United States. That there are, just as Candace said, we should be celebrating each one of our origins, each one of our cultures, but we also need to understand that this country was founded on a principle of racism that had much of our economy run off of it, and that it is not so quickly to say that a civil war absolved us of it and a civil rights movement cleaned up the rest of the mess, that this caste system continues to pull us in and grind us over, and that we should all be aware of how that caste system perpetuates itself even amongst our immigrant community, which might be coming at it from a different angle and might, because again of their socioeconomic background, not be in the same position as a black person may be.
Okay, well, we had another comment or question rather from the audience asking for a source that can give definitions to the terms such as racism, unconscious bias, systemic racism, equity versus equality, so that they can engage more actively in listening sessions about diversity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of books out there that I've been recommending. Ibram Kendi wrote a book called How to Be Anti-Racist. That's, sort of a playbook. It was written in 2019, but I think that conversation and the term anti-racist goes back even further than that, and he talks about that in his book. White Fragility is another book that is good to read, to understand, to get that perspective of privilege and what that means. And sometimes folks say privilege is like such a bad word, and racist is such a bad word. And I'm like, if we try to move beyond that and understand, to Tom's point, the history, and understand the origins of these words and why we are where we are, and how this relates to everything from housing policy to education to economic opportunities to health disparities, then we can get past those words and start to actually have conversations. But Tom, I'm sure you have other book recommendations in addition to Cass, of course.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've got nothing but book recommendations. Yet right now I'm just focused so much on Cast because it was such a great book. I guess more than just reading, because I know myself as a white guy, I feel like I can throw myself into literature, read my way out of it, and then I'll get to the other side of it. I think the best thing that any of us can do, and that includes regardless of our background, is get over the offense and the baggage that comes with words such as racist and racism. Because if we can talk to one another openly and say, what you just said was racist, and not have that not be the end of the conversation, not only the end of the conversation, but the end of the relationship, we will be in a much better position to engage on these issues, because it is not ourselves that are racists. It is the ideas that we are carrying with us that might have been buried in us when we were 4 years old and we have it our entire life. Those are the things that are racist, but it is not something that we are forced to continue to operate with. And that if we can have these open conversations that really are engaging and invigorating in many ways, because you can see the sort of the scales fall away, as said in the good book. If you can do that, you can only do that by getting rid of these artificial constructs that like that's what this woman was doing, Jane Elliott, on this show. She was trying to get people to say, I'm not going to say racist and racism, but I'm going to say blue eyes and brown eyes, and we're going to get to the same place.
I think that's such a good point. In the original, so for some more context, Jane Elliott originally did that in 1968 with her third grade classroom. And this was right after the assassination of Dr. King. And she did the same exercise with a group of third graders. And I don't know if anyone's had the opportunity to watch that video, and I hope that we can share it. I'll figure out how to do that in the chat when I'm not talking. But if you look at that video and look how the children who were told at a very young age, this is third grade, so you're saying 8 and 9 years old, they were told that you are different because of your eye color, and therefore you are not as smart, not as talented, not as bright. You don't deserve the same things as and she switches it back and forth. So you don't deserve the same things as the other group of folks with different eye color. And to see their body language and to see how they responded to that is powerful. I mean, it's really powerful. And so these things can be ingrained in folks when they're very young. And it takes some time. We were talking about this at UMBC recently. It takes time to undo some of the things that you've learned when you were young, and things that you may have seen on TV, or that your parents may have told you, or that you were assuming and basing, how you think about people. You're basing them on these stereotypes. It takes some time to undo that. And it's a fascinating look at, if you go back and watch that original video when she did that in '68 with children. And we saw that a little bit in the video that we watched as well. If you looked at how the blue-eyed folks were reacting, and before they even got into the studio, when they were singing and chanting and everything, and sort of they were expressing themselves in a way that showed that they were outraged, that they were, it was outrageous that they were being treated that way. And that's telling. I mean, right? That tells a story. It's tiring to be treated a certain way and generalized because you happen to be born with something that you cannot control, whether it's blue eyes or brown skin or white skin, right? It's something that you can't control, and to be ostracized and treated a certain way because of that is tiring. It's tiring. And so
that's the best part of the video.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I mean,
no, it's good.
the affront of these people who have lived their lives just as I have, sort of getting the benefit of the doubt, presumed to be needed in every room that they appear, presumed to be wanted, presumed to be treasured, and to just experience, I mean, they're going to see Oprah Winfrey, and just to experience the inconveniences that were put on them for a matter of hours, and to be so offended. I think that is what many people, when they come from a position of privilege and receive any resistance, they presume something must be wrong. Something wrong must have occurred. And that is what we saw with these people. But as you've described, Candace, like, that is the life of many people of color. That is something and that is why it is so critical that those of us in positions of privilege, whether that is socioeconomic privilege, racial privilege, or what have you, it is so important for the anti-racism activity and thoughts to be engaged with, because it's not enough to say, all right, like, there is nothing more offensive in many circumstances than someone to say, I don't see race.
Right.
Because that means let's forget everything else. Let's even forget the fact that the person next to me does see race, and they're going to use it in a bad way that's going to hurt a lot of people. I don't see race. Right. Like that's why that phrase is a non-starter.
Yeah, I see a comment in the chat, and I just wanted to comment about, to give you an example of how this plays out. If you remember in the video, there was a gentleman who said, who was wearing the green collar, which, by the way, you can take off the green collar, right? There were people who took off the green collar and walked out. I can't take off my black face. And so let's be really clear about how this was an exercise and not real life, and how they reacted and felt, right? But to put it to practice, there was a gentleman in the video who said, oh my gosh, they followed me in the bathroom, and they were there in the bathroom, and they followed me. I can't tell you how many times I have been followed in a store. My brother and sister-in-law used to live on the Upper East Side in New York. We went to, I can't even remember the street, Fifth Avenue. I went there with my daughter when she was 5 years old. We were looking around. We were shopping in a store that I won't name. And I had every intent of buying something in the unnamed store, and walked in. And as soon as I walked in, 2 security guards followed me from behind. I'm with my 5-year-old, okay? Followed me from behind. I had 2 people come up to me and say, is there something you need? Can I help you? Is there something you need? I said, no, I'm looking around and just want to, I'm looking around. And it went on for it went on so long that my 5-year-old could identify what was going on. She's like, why is no one else why aren't they asking anyone else any questions, right? So like a child could figure this out. And that's just one example. This happens all of the time. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with my now 20-year-old about driving while Black, right? And so there's a historical piece that has gotten us to where we are. And we can certainly talk about policies, and we can talk about redlining. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about that shows a history of systemic racism. And there's the policy piece, and then there's the practice piece, and the things that we have to live with every day, and the trauma that we deal with, and having to explain over and over and over again why we're treated differently simply because of what we look like and the color of our skin.
Yeah, I mean, I have something to build off of that, and I guess this is the third rail, but I'm going to touch it anyway, which is that we in Howard County recently had a very large redistricting fight, and I'm not going to go into the merits of the plan or whether or not it should have passed or what have you, but I am going to say that there was an interesting dynamic there where you had immigrant communities living in wealthy single-family detached neighborhoods that were working very hard to stay in the school that they thought was entitled to them because of the neighborhood that they lived in. There was a racial dynamic, not because of anything that they said or didn't say, but because of the legacy of racism in Howard County, and not just Howard County, the state, the country, that we were having schools which were primarily children of Black children, Hispanic children, that were being redistricted, and there was poverty in those schools as well. And it became a discussion of, well, don't say race, because there is a Supreme Court decision saying that you cannot redistrict on the basis of race, but race was baked into the discussion. So that sort of shows the dynamic of why it is a caste system, and why our discussions on redistricting do have this racial dynamic, because poverty, because of segregation, because of redlining, because of all of the ills that we carry with us just by being Americans, they show up in every public discussion, and sort of why you can differentiate in many circumstances the how Black men and women are treated from how others are treated in this country.
I didn't know, Pat, if you had any other questions for us. I was trying to look at the chat, but I could not tell if there was anything else in there. If not, I can certainly go on to something else.
Well, we don't have any other questions from the audience, but I think, just the relevance between the timing of what had happened, what was transpiring in the United States when Oprah did the show, and then what's been going on today. And I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit more about the current situation and the current events with the Black Lives Matter and movement.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to touch on that a bit, and Tom certainly jump in. I think I'm calling this the second pandemic, right? We are in challenging times in this country, regardless of political affiliation. There's been a failure of leadership, and the first pandemic, and I hate to even rank them, but pandemic one, we'll call it, is certainly what has happened with COVID. And we can talk about, and Jane touched on this a little bit in the video, about the outrage if there were 59,000 people, I think she said, who, or there was more, 150,000 people, I think, who she said died from AIDS, if there was just, white people who had died, and it was not gay folks who identify as LGBTQ who had died. And right now we're in a pandemic where the numbers of Black and Latinx people who are dying, the number of the people of color who are dying, are disproportionately higher than any other race, right? Those who are dying from COVID-19. And so, history continues to repeat itself in that sense. We're also at a time where, and I hope that it feels different. I don't know why, but it feels different. Maybe it's because we're able to pay more attention because we're all home and we're following the footage, but it feels like we're in sort of the second, maybe third coming of a civil rights movement to address the killing of Black folks, right? This is not new. This is not new. We can go back to Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter movement started with the death of Trayvon Martin, which was, 7 years ago, right? And so, but I think we're at a time, hopefully at a time, where we're starting to look in the mirror as America and say, this is no longer acceptable. It's no longer acceptable to treat people like this. I started with Breonna Taylor. It's no longer okay to kill Black women who are laying in their bed in their home, right? And so my hope is that, and people get caught up in like the Black Lives Matter movement and saying Black Lives Matter and actually taking that and moving it to action. It's one thing to, and I said this like over and over and over again, probably people are tired of hearing me saying this, but it's one thing to hold up a sign and go to a rally and go to a march and say Black Lives Matter. Okay, I'm glad you did that. But now, how are we moving from that? And this goes into being how to be an anti-racist. How are we moving from that to looking at solutions? How are we looking at policies? How are we looking at initiatives? How are we looking at how we even treat people to move beyond just saying Black Lives Matter into really addressing the root cause of these issues? And, that's sort of where I am. And I hope that's where we are in this country right now as we're dealing with this, as I'm calling it, additional pandemic.
So Candace and I talk just about every day. We have a podcast together called Elevate Maryland. And one phrase that sadly I hear Candace say often is, I'm tired. And I think that is an important inflection point for all of us, that this second pandemic, this opportunity to discuss these difficult issues, we cannot be reliant on another Black preacher from the South to come and tell us how things need to be. We need to listen to our brothers and sisters of color, but white people need to get off their butts and do the work, because racism is not a Black people problem. It's a white people problem. And so what I would encourage us to do in response to all of this, and listen, I know from personal experience how uncomfortable it is to aggressively talk about this issue, because you'll be told that you're trying to value signal, you're virtue signaling, or you don't even know. How are you to say what's racism, what's racist and not racist? And that's why the most important thing is to listen. 2 ears, one mouth. Listen, but we must engage on this issue. We must engage on this issue amongst our family members, our friends, our white networks, our exclusively white networks, to really do the work.
And Tom, that brings me to one of our guests' questions. It was for Candace, but do you think it's possible for Black and white people to have close friendships, but without discussing racism?
Ooh, wow. I'll be honest and say, I'm not sure you can have an authentic relationship with someone who does not look like you, a Black-white relationship, without discussing race. I'm not sure how you can have an authentic relationship without discussing race. Because, I have friends who I talk about these things with. It's not comfortable. Tom and I talk about it. It's not comfortable. But it's important because the perspective is important. It's just a different perspective, and that's okay. I'm not asking people who are white to understand my perspective, because you cannot, right? But you can empathize with what I'm going through, and I'm not sure you get that without authentic dialogue with friends or with other folks. I think conversation. Tom laughs at me. I have coffee with just about everybody before COVID, and I'll have virtual coffee with just about everybody. And those aren't even like my close friends, right? I'm not sure you can have authentic relationships with people of, and I'll say of any other race, without discussing, again, what the beautiful things that make us different and the beautiful things that are similar about us. I don't know how you do it.
And we have someone, a guest here, who is saying that Columbia's ethos was to treat everyone the same. Do you think there's any difference in the way people here in Columbia face racism than other parts of Maryland or the country?
Tom, you want to start with that? We both grew up here, so we can probably give a perspective, but Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, and you got to be careful around here saying anything of a critique about Jim Rouse. And this is not a critique about him in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, as much as a critique about the conversation then. And the conversation then was to treat everyone the same, because we were coming out of such a dark period where people were killed for the color of their skin. So a nice refuge from that would be to treat everyone the same. But I think, as Candace has repeatedly said, we do need to recognize, treasure, and value the different perspectives, different backgrounds, different cultures of everyone, and recognize that we are white and Black and Latinx and LGBTQ, and celebrate those things. And so I think in that celebration, that is where you actually get more diverse networks, because treating everyone the same is how you might get an all-white board of directors, because you're treating everyone the same. And whatever resume came across your desk, that's what you looked at. That's how you might get all white employees. But treasuring and valuing and lifting up diversity is a different approach, and I would suggest a better one.
The other thing I'll add to that, and I think that was great, Tom, is that, being intentional about seeking out folks who are different than you is so important. And I'll go back to, I can't remember the name of the person in the chat who was talking about being an immigrant, but one of the things that I do often in the workplace is set up these meetings with, and again, I'm famous for like some coffees and some meetings, but that's how I learn from people who are different than me. And so I'll set up these coffees and these meetings and have intentional time with people who are different than me so that I can learn about different cultures and experience different things and understand perspective. And I don't think we do that enough in this country at all, particularly as it relates to Black folks. I just don't think we do it enough. And I think, and that's why I was saying the having authentic relationships with your friends. I don't think your friend, I don't know the race of the person who asked that question, but I don't think your friends would be offended. Your authentic friends would be offended if you said, let's talk about things from your perspective. I had a friend, a white woman, who called me recently and said, I know that you're experiencing trauma, and I know that this is hard, and I know you still have a job to do where you address these things every day and work, with Dr. Abowski every day on these issues, and I know it's hard. And she said, and I'm going to hang up the phone right now, and that's all I'm going to say to you. I mean, I got off the phone and cried, and I was like, that is perhaps the most meaningful thing that someone outside of my family has said to me, right? To acknowledge that this is not easy to process trauma every day, and to raise a Black girl who's away at college, dealing with these issues, grappling with these issues without her family, and still show up in a way where we want to have conversations like this. It's not easy. And if you're authentic with your friends, I think they would appreciate that.
Well, I know we had set a time limit of 8 o'clock. We're just about there.
That was fast.
we have a couple of more questions if you're available. Someone had asked, when you say celebrate the differences and celebrate the similarities, what does celebrate mean to you?
Ooh, well, I could go on and on about this. I mean, I think, and again, I'm not trying to be trite with saying these things about conversations, but like, what do I cherish as a Black woman? What do you think I like? Asking me questions about what I like as a Black woman. I could ask the same question about, any other person in any other race. Like, what does it mean to be you? What are you experiencing? I appreciate that and understand that and respect that that's your perspective, right? Tell me a little bit more about your culture, and don't make it a burden, right? Like, don't make it like this weird, awkward thing where you're like, tell me all the things about you and like, just dump. Like, make it some sort of authentic conversation. Take me out. What was I started this by talking about stories. And I was doing a training the other day, and we started off with stories. And this was kind of neat. It was a guy who identified as conservative and identified as a white male. And the thing, and I'm me, as I've said, and the thing that we had in common when we were telling our stories at the beginning of this training is that both of our parents were in the military. My father was in the military, his father was in the military, and he talked about his experience of being a military kid, and I talked about my experience of being a military kid, and we had this bond. He sent me a note after the meeting, after the training, and he said, I'm not sure that we would ever have any kind of conversation. And he said, I didn't even think that we had anything in common. And he said, the fact that you started with stories and allowed us to share makes me feel like I know you. I'm having virtual coffee with that guy in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks. I mean, we wouldn't even meet, right? Like, and we're not going to agree on, I'm telling you right now, we're not going to agree on policy, like, and we're not going to agree on politics, maybe. But the fact that we're having conversation and this guy found what was similar about us and wanted to explore more and learn about me, and I wanted to do the same, is important.
If I could just build off of that, I mean, how I see celebrate is as much self-care as anything else. I mean, the life is is in the enjoyment of life is in variety, and actually being and having a network of diverse people and diverse friends. You know, who wants to be in a network where everybody is the same, likes the same thing, and all you talk about is how you all agree with one another. So I think celebration is in the same way you celebrate your friends and how they are a different person and how their interests are interesting to you. Celebrating different cultures means engaging with those cultures and being interested and wanting to know about them. I mean, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for another person is ask them a question that you deeply care about and you're interested in them. So that is what I mean by celebrate.
Yeah, and Farida, I hope I pronounced that right. Farida, I appreciate your comment. I'm finally figuring out how to see the comments as they come in. You said something you once heard about diversity has stayed with you. Inviting them to the dance is fine, but dancing with them is what matters. Absolutely. That's the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? That's the difference. Like, you can invite folks all you want to the dance, or you can invite folks to the table. But if you don't care to hear what they say or don't care to understand their perspective, you're not including them. That's the inclusion piece. And that's where we need to get. And then once we get there, we have to get to the belonging piece, right? Like, how do you make sure they still want to stay at the table? And I think that's such an important point. And I hear you that you're tired, and I get it, trust me.
Well, and since we're past 8 o'clock now, and we can certainly let everyone know that they can find the Elevate Maryland podcasts at elevatemdpodcast.com to continue having these discussions or hearing the discussions with Tom and Candace. I'd also like to invite everyone to Residences at Vantage Point's third in our series of the Community Rising programs next Wednesday, September 30th at 7 p.m., which will focus on cultural literacy. We'll start with a TED Talk video of 2 young authors of the textbook, Tell Me Who You Are. And then afterwards, we'll see and hear a conversation between Tabina Taj, member of the Howard County Board of Education, and Uma Ribeiro, a Hammond High School junior. Candace, Tom, I thank you so much for this very enlightening, interesting conversation. We really appreciate you participating and joining Residences at Vantage Point in our 30th anniversary celebrations. And thank you all to all of our guests for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful night and hope to see you back next week.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. Thanks for doing this. I saw something that someone wants to connect with us in the chat, and if it's okay, the organizers could share our information, our email, or however, to folks who want to continue the conversation. And check us out on Elevate Maryland. We talk about this kind of stuff all the time.
Right, and there is a link for eradicating national origin discrimination on the chat, nationaloriginalliance.org.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you.
A wonderful evening, everyone.